Okay, I think we'll probably make a start. I hope everyone's here. I'm sure anyone that joins late will be able to pick up from wherever we are. So welcome everyone to this Jigsaw 24 webinar titled Developing Sustainable One-to-One Learning. The focus is on how to successfully implement, develop and sustain a one-to-one iPad for Learning program. We're very happy to welcome colleagues from two organisations that we work alongside. We have three senior people from Red Kite Learning Trust: Daly, Principal at Crawshaw Academy; Steve Howell, CFO; and David Burns, the Trustee IT Manager from Red Kite Learning Trust. Welcome to the three of you, and thanks for supporting the event. And we also have Jonathan Oram from Pagabo, and he's their National Framework Manager. And Jonathan's here to add a little piece on frameworks a little bit later. So each contributor will introduce themselves when it gets to their turn. And speaking of turns, just a quick view of the agenda. We're going to spend 10 minutes on three key topics, keeping the focus on teaching and learning, sustainable finance, and dependable infrastructure. And we're going to top that off with a short piece about frameworks from Jonathan. We're then going to spend hopefully sort of 10 or so minutes on your questions. And regarding questions, if you have any questions as the webinar progresses, could you please pop them in the chat and we'll pick them up at around about 4:45 and hopefully have a good question and answer session with the panel. And then we'll have some closing statements and finish in good time for 5 o'clock. So thank you for joining, and let's move forward. So just a tiny piece, and not too much at all, you'll be glad to hear about your hosts today, Jigsaw 24. We are the UK's largest Apple reseller. We are both an Apple authorized enterprise reseller and an Apple authorized education specialist. Here's a selection of our customers in the enterprise space, and our education customers find it very reassuring to know that we support customers at this level and at this scale. Our education customers, here is a selection. We have thousands of accounts functioning at the moment. These are some of the highlight accounts for us, some of our lighthouses. Many of these are Apple Distinguished Schools, EdTech Top 50, and some of the country's leading trusts. And you can see Red Kite is one of those on this slide. We pride ourselves in supporting decision makers with the entire process. We have a program called the Leading Innovation Program that helps decision makers, schools, and trusts with every element required to make sure your deployment is successful and has a deep impact on teaching and learning in your organization. The driver for this particular webinar is really this. Steve Howell, who's going to speak later, describes this as the three-legged stool. And unfortunately, I'm not good enough to draw a stool, so I did a bit of a diagram instead. But the point being that in order for you to achieve impact in your organization on teaching and learning, you really need to have three key pieces in place simultaneously, and they would be a focus on teaching and learning absolutely front and center, dependable and reliable infrastructure, invisible infrastructure, if you like, in the classroom, so teaching and learning can just go forward in the classroom, and a sustainable finance model that means you can continue to deploy and develop your organization. And we'll be hearing about those three pieces from the three speakers. So without further ado, I'm going to pass across to Daly, who is the principal at Crawshaw Academy. Over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As Mike said, I'm a principal at Crawshaw Academy. In a previous life, I was a deputy at Ilkley Grammar School, where 8-9 years ago we implemented at the same time as Harrogate Grammar School a one-to-one iPad scheme at a time when bringing in one-to-one devices was very much not so much cutting edge as bleeding edge. Things have moved on considerably in terms of the technology and the understanding of these devices. And once again, I am involved at Crawshaw in implementing a one-to-one, but also looking at that from a trust perspective in terms of a sustainable model to ensure equitable access across our 13 schools. Go to the next slide, please, Mike. So I think in terms of this slide here, it's not about a device. And very quickly, these schemes go awry when people think a device will lead to improved standards. It starts with teachers understanding what makes great learning. And it's the inspiration that comes from those people that are properly trained, that really understand the pedagogy behind an iPad. If you don't have that, if you don't have that vision, then it is pointless. And as I've said there, it's not about a device. It's not about an app per se, but getting the right device and choosing the right apps is essential. And on the right-hand side, you'll see an old model now, the SAMA model, and thinking as a school, what is it that this device is going to bring to my classroom or to the school environment? So from a substitution point of view, perhaps it's replacing a textbook with an online book, all the way through to where you're actually looking at a very different way of delivering education, things that would have been impossible without this sort of technology. Can we move on again, please, Mike? So this I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I think this is one of the most important steps to implementing a one-to-one strategy, being very clear from the outset about why you are doing this. Contextually for your school, which is why whatever is in there, that very much is Crawshaw specific in terms of what we need, where our students are, why we think this will benefit, and the direction of travel. And I think this slide deck will be sent out, so I'll let you have a look and unpick. But I think that's one of the crucial stages that you need to think about for success, because from there become your success criteria. Can we move on again? So this is the question these are the questions that we were thinking about. And these questions are the exact same questions now as they were 7 or 8 years ago. So if you look through in terms of students having a device to use as and when they need, you don't go into an IT room that they've had to book weeks in advance, and they're forced to do IT for a full hour because you've got that space, you might as well use it. There's inevitably not enough IT rooms, but you use the IT for a part of a lesson and then you move on. It doesn't dominate the lesson. It's not about we're in an IT room and it's something exciting. It's part and parcel of what you do. For us, it is about, as a trust, one of our key principles is that equity of opportunity and making sure the students, the 8,500 students across our trust, whatever their socioeconomic background, everybody gets one of these devices and benefits from the advantages they provide. I think for me, it is very much about moving away from a teacher-fed didactic approach to empowering that learning for students, allowing them to create and recreate knowledge and understanding and present and share that rather than the teaching running through a PowerPoint. I think increasingly the low stakes testing, understanding where students are very quickly at the beginning of a lesson, and then being able to modify that lesson there and then, as opposed to, you may have differentiated worksheets and a whole very labor intensive for the member of staff ability to respond to what the students are telling you. So a quick low stakes test at the start, understand who gets it, who doesn't, and very quickly you can throw out different resources to individuals or groups of students. I think one of the key things I've put in there, it is about improving student outcomes in terms of what they do. And I think one of the things that we have seen is the pride that students take when they produce something that looks professional to them, and the pride. And we've had some students recently going home and talking to parents about what they've been learning, what they've been doing in the classroom. We've mentioned really that personalised learning through effective and manageable differentiation. It brings a whole range of different technologies. You know, you put a camera on a device, a microphone on a device, an accelerometer, and suddenly things that you couldn't do, students couldn't do, teachers couldn't use during a lesson, suddenly they have that access, and it really does transform the learning. I think for one of the things that we were really interested in is breaking down that barrier between home school learning, but also between lessons, because this is their device. It goes from lesson to lesson. So if you want to take something whereby they're collecting data, creating data, and then they move to mathematics, for example, where they might do the analysis of that data, through to English, where they're communicating and explaining and feeding that back, it does seamlessly allow that sort of continuity and authentic learning experiences, you know, making it real to the students, and also breaking down that barrier between home and school, because there may be a video that you want all students to watch. I don't want them to have to watch that in 10-15 minutes in a lesson. They can watch that at home, and they come to the social learning where the teacher can really develop that thinking, challenge that thinking, and it just creates more time in that lesson. I think one of the things that I'm really interested in terms of our trust implementation is how we can radically change the curriculum, because at the moment many schools, you'll have a classroom, 30 students in a 60-metre square box, and that's quite restrictive. If suddenly your students have a device in their hand, then suddenly the model of, well, we're going to do a lead lecture, a lead keynote in the theatre, and then we'll break off, and certain students will go and do an experiment in a room. Some students will work independently. Some students will move into a tube time, but you can suddenly say to your head of science on your timetable, you're going to have 150 students with you for the next 2 hours, and they can work differently. And the important thing for me there really is, with limited resource in terms of staffing, some students can work really well independently for a chunk of that time, and then you can refocus your resource on those students that aren't as effective at doing that, who need the additional support. So again, trying to tackle those equality, equity issues. And I think one-to-one devices, there's, you know, people would say, you know, why don't you just have a bring your own device into you've got a wireless network. I think a device that all teachers and students have is critical in terms of what is the student seeing for the teacher. So they know that I've produced this resource at home, and I know that every single teacher, every single student will see exactly the same thing as I'm seeing, without thinking, oh, it doesn't quite look like that on my screen. So it's and they for me are the key things around a one-to-one device from a learning point of view, and it is about learning. If we could move on, Mike. I think these are efficiencies that they bring, you know, so in terms of improved communication, students have a device, you know, they can send those messages quickly to them. You know, suddenly you're not paying for an expensive, fairly completely static IT suite, and all of that continuous capital investment that's required every 3 years, and the energy in terms of powering that, and then perhaps the air conditioning. So it frees up a number of rooms, and that for school may mean, you know, well, I can take an extra form of entry. One of the big things is staff workload and planning in terms of online resources. We've seen that through COVID. We've seen that shift to sort of digital curriculum, and rather than that that Monday morning when there's a sudden rush to get to a photocopier. We don't need to rush to a photocopier. The resources are there, and they are literally pushed out to the students, or mirrored through an Apple TV or through other mirroring technology. And that brings then obviously reduced photocopying costs. It brings things such as, do you need a student paper planner? So you can start to roll this scheme into a wider cultural change for the school. So moving on then, please, Mike. So I'm not intending to go through these questions in any detail. I could strongly argue any of those questions from 4 nights of having parental information evenings prior to the one-to-one scheme going live at Ilkley. We got these questions, and I stood on stage for an hour and a half having questions thrown, because the work that we'd done before and we had answers to those. That was 8-9 years ago, when the technology that now sits on an iPad wasn't anywhere near where it is now. So those questions are actually even easier to answer. The one thing I would say in answer to all of those questions, your answer always comes back to a learning point of view. It improves learning. And if you stick to that message, people are persuaded. So I think at that point, I am going to hand on to Mr. Howell, who is going to talk through sustainable finance.
Thanks, Adam. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Adam. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm CFO at Red Kite Learning Trust, and prior to becoming a trust, I was the school business manager at Harrogate Grammar School. And preparing for this session has brought back some happy memories, actually. I was thinking back to the 2012 London Olympics. You remember those? Well, I was a volunteer at the London Olympics, and as part of that process, I learned quite a lot, actually. And some of that learning I applied when back in October, half-term 2012, working very closely with Dave, who's on the call. We handed out 1,000 iPads to excited students and their families, actually, that half-term at Harrogate Grammar. I remember thinking, gosh, we've got £250,000 worth of kit stuck on pallets in the hall over the weekend, and I better get a padlock to help with the security. But I think for me, it comes back right to Mike's diagram there, and my first sort of financial learning point, next slide, Mike, is really around having education first. Although you need that underpinning of the network team and the finance team getting the support right, without the likes of Adam, and in our case, Adam's predecessor at Harrogate Grammar School, really understanding and infusing and effervescing about the educational benefits, and Adam used the T word, the transforming benefits of a one-to-one scheme. Without that education first, I think the scheme is doomed to failure. I'm going to talk more about the financial considerations in a minute, but just quickly, in terms of values and principles, I think Adam mentioned the universality word. We had 3. Universality, in other words, we wanted every pupil, regardless of what their parents thought or what their parents could afford, to participate in our scheme. We wanted it to be sustainable. In other words, that the school could afford it not just this year, but going forward. And we wanted it to be affordable for parents. We wanted to be fair to parents. We wanted to listen to parents if they were struggling with affordability. So those 3 key principles of universality, sustainability, and affordability were really important to us. And the next learning was really about planning in detail and being cautious about that plan and seeking advice from experts. So it's knowing, I think, who our partners are, who your partners will be in this. For us, our partners included the Learning Foundation, the charity who have helped us set up and run the scheme. As a finance guy, our external auditors have been helpful as we shape the scheme, checking we've got things right. And latterly, we've turned to Jigsaw as a partner, and they've been really helpful actually as we think about rolling this more widely across the 13 schools in our trust. And finally, you'll hear shortly from Pagabo, who've been excellent partners in making sure that whenever we buy, in our case, iPads, we get really good value and we get a competitive process to ensure best value. So planning in detail, but the next thing, and Adam touched on this, is anticipating the challenges. And as he well remembers, you know, there were lots of these back in 2012. And I think the one tip I would really give is really concentrate on your let's call them the FAQs, those questions that you anticipate are going to come as you go out to consult with parents. What are the objections you're going to get? What's the parental resistance going to be? How are you going to manage things like breakages? At Harrogate Grammar, for example, we ask parents to contribute if there is a screen breakage to an iPad. The hard truth is it costs approaching £100 to put that right. So we do ask parents to contribute towards that. But how will you plan for that? And what is the exact detail of how that looks? So I think my tip would be write your FAQs in advance of your parental consultation. And then be prepared to learn and iterate your scheme over time. I'm proud actually, I know David feels the same, that by and large the scheme we put together in 2012 has endured, but we have tweaked that over time. So now, for example, we don't allow kids to bring in their own iPad from home anymore. We've changed the way we do mobile device management. We've changed the way we handle breakages. And so we've learned. And David and I made a mistake, to be fair, when we did the original pilot, because we didn't have at the centre the educationalist really driving and pushing the benefits and carrying the teaching staff with them. But we learned from that pilot and we iterated and we came up with a scheme that was sustainable. And so just a few minutes now on the financial considerations. Firstly, you need to think about VAT. I'm sorry to mention it, but if you're having you can claim the VAT back when you buy devices, but you need to be careful about how you frame your scheme in relation to your parents. Are you talking about a rental scheme, or are you talking about a donation scheme, or indeed a sale scheme? Be careful there. We benefit from gift aid. I mentioned our partnership with the Learning Foundation, and it allows us to go ahead with confidence and claim the gift aid on the donations that come in. But if you do that, what proportion of your donors will qualify for gift aid? And then around take-up, what are your financial assumptions about the way parents will respond and the level of take-up? And I encourage you to work with your finance lead to come up with a really careful model so that you can analyse what will be the impact of varying success around take-up. I've touched on breakages. How are you going to cover that £100 of repair costs? And then I remember being on the poll tax march in the late 80s, and the chant there was can't pay, won't pay, can't pay, won't pay. And so it is with parents that we found there's a combination. There's some parents who understandably can't pay, they just cannot afford to donate. But there were a few parents who were, for small p political reasons, not happy to participate. They wouldn't participate. They wouldn't support the scheme for a myriad of reasons, actually, as Adam touched on. But how are you going to handle those? How are you going to work with the can't pay people? How are you going to work with the won't pay people? And to what extent will you use discretion when you're having those conversations? Or will you be formulaic about your approach? And will you dip into things, special pots of money like pupil premium, to help bridge those gaps? In terms of how to fund the scheme, I think there are three options. You can either lease, you can use your revenue budget, or you can use your reserves. And those three methods help you top up any gaps you have from parental contributions. For us, we were able to use reserves, and that was, as a CFO, that was my favoured route, because it meant that we weren't paying the additional cost of the lease interest. And then there's a question about how to and whether to insure. Actually, we decided to self-insure, so we took the risk ourselves. And I don't regret doing that, although we do have to manage carefully the breakage costs. But there is an option to insure. I'd say don't underestimate the administrative effort. We've employed and continue to have a 30 hours per week administrator in school who is dedicated to the iPad scheme and making sure that runs efficiently and cost effectively. So Michelle is on hand if a parental donation dries up, and she'll sensitively work to see if the family can reinstate their donations. And then there's all the other costs around the infrastructure, which in a moment David will touch on, the Wi-Fi, the apps, the admin costs I've just described, the additional technical resource you'll need, the CPD for staff, the staff iPads, and so it goes on. And in that context, I return to Adam's points about, are there some bold changes and adjustments you can make to the way you deliver your curriculum as a result of this investment in the technology. At Harrogate Grammar School, for example, we finished school early on a Wednesday and allowed students to carry on with their studies under their own steam using those devices in part. So are there some bold savings that can help you potentially overcome the financial hurdle of getting going with a one-to-one scheme? And the final point here, having talked on all those financial considerations, is just around your context. And it's a recognition that the schools in our trust are very different. And so what might work in Leafy Lane, Harrogate, affluent Harrogate, may not work down the road at the school in our trust that has nearly 70% pupil premium children. And indeed, it may not work at Adam's school at Crawshaw, when he just has or will just have 5-year groups to consider. So we're looking at a bespoke scheme for Adam's school, where instead of having a refresh point halfway through one school career, we just have one iPad that starts midway through year 8. So we're responsive to the changes and challenges of our context. But I think that's a whistle stop through some of the financial lessons that we've learned. And at that point, I'll hand over to David to talk you through some of the network and technical challenges. Thank you.
Afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. So my name is David Burns. I'm the Trust IT Manager for Red Kite Learning Trust. And before this, as Steve mentioned, I worked with him at Harrogate Grammar School, helping to develop and implement the one-to-one solution that they use there. And I've spoken with a number of schools and trusts about one-to-one devices and just about how they can implement them and how they can help them make a success of them, and how they can get the best out of them within their schools. I found, generally speaking, that there are 3 main areas to look at. So the first one is foundations. Next slide, please, Mike. Whenever you're doing anything with any sort of scheme like this, the devices are great, but if in order to actually get the most out of them, you need to connect them up to the network. And as you can see from the house there, if you don't have it, you can have the nicest place possible, but if you don't have it built on a good foundation, then it's just not going to be very useful at all. And the last thing you want to do is spend a lot of money on devices like iPads or laptops or whatever, just to have them really function as expensive bricks or doorstops. So most mobile devices, the way that they'll be used within a school, they'll need to connect to the wireless infrastructure. So you might already have wireless, but can your wireless cope with 30 devices up and running in every classroom? How about 30 devices up and running in every single classroom at the same time? If it can, great. And then you think, though, the wireless has to connect back to the wired infrastructure. So are your switches able to cope with all of that traffic that's coming through? And you'll see a lot more traffic. If you've got 30 devices within a classroom, that's a lot more than, say, the one PC that you've already got in there at the moment. And even then, when it's gone through there, most of the time, these devices are going to be used for accessing resources out on the internet. So what is your broadband connection like? Can that cope with the increased demand of, say, 30 students all trying to stream video from YouTube, or even every student within the school trying to stream a video over YouTube? So those are three things to consider. But underpinning all of that really is the IT support. Bringing in devices into schools, particularly for a one-to-one scheme, means that the support that you are getting for your IT solution, rather than being maybe one device for every classroom or with a couple of IT suites in there, that's moving up to being one device for every single student, plus as well as supporting the existing computers that you have in there. So in the case of Howell Grammar School, for instance, that's got 90 classrooms. So it's moving from really supporting sort of 90 main points of focus to over 2,000 when all the students had a device, and that can have quite a big demand on the staff. So again, ensuring you've got enough staff to cope with that helps make this scheme a success. But the exact requirements certainly from a staffing point of view, as well as some of the other bits and pieces, all depend a bit on how you actually want to manage your devices. So next slide, please, Mike. So when you're managing devices, really it starts off around the deployment side of things. So this is when you get the devices delivered into school. You can, depending on how you purchase them, you can get them pre-configured and ready to go out of the box. So all you have to do is basically just give them out to the students or the parents. They can take them home, unwrap the wrapper around them, and the devices will be pretty much ready to go. Some resellers who you purchase the devices from will also pre-label the devices as well, so they can actually be named up for each student to give that student a personalized experience, for getting something brand new, and that is, as I say, pre-configured and ready for them to use. But think about how the devices are actually given out to the students and how much training do the students need to actually use them. For some students, they might be perfectly fine using phones and getting ready to getting the most out of those, particularly from a home use environment. But if it's coming to doing things like putting, say, their school email accounts on the device, or even just doing things like working through the setup process on the devices so that they can have them ready for school, it's worth considering what sort of instructions you're going to need to pass on to them. And to the same, it's around how much training the staff are going to need as well, because the staff will have to have devices. And you really want to make sure that the staff get devices well ahead of the students, if only to familiarise themselves with them. What we did at the grammar school when we did this 10 years ago was we made sure to give the devices out to the staff, but encourage them to treat it as almost a personal device initially, so they could install whatever they wanted it, just so they got familiar with the interface and how it worked. And again, making this sort of fun experience for both the staff and the students can help enormously in terms of familiarity. If it's just being seen as effectively a work device, then that can mean people putting it to one side of it. Whereas if it's something that they can use to watch, say, Netflix or something on it, or even play games, that can help enormously in terms of, let's say, familiarity and helping them see the possibilities of using the device within a classroom environment. For the actual device management themselves, this comes in a couple of different flavors here. So as I mentioned, you can pre-configure the devices, but how do you want the devices to be configured? You can do things like put language settings on them, set them up to auto-connect to the school wireless as well. But what settings should staff and students be able to change? Should they be able to basically define their own length of password? Does the device need a password? These are all things to think about, particularly from a security point of view. You generally want to make sure that a staff device, if they left it unattended for a couple of minutes, the students can't pick it up and instantly send emails to the head teacher or to the rest of the staff, because that'll be fun for the student, but not so much for the teacher. And likewise, all this kind of feeds a bit into the acceptable use policy as well. So it's worth engaging with the students to actually define what they think is acceptable behavior for using these devices, and almost get them to manage the devices themselves. That can help enormously, particularly if you've got a student council, and get them involved in this. As well as the actual configuration of the devices themselves, think as well about the applications that you're putting onto them. So how do you want to purchase those and manage those? It's really helpful to have a consistency of approach, both in terms of what applications are on each iPad, but also as well across the school. So each department is doing the same sort of thing. that helps from a licensing point of view, which helps from a cost side of things, and also with data protection, because then you can ensure that every bit of information is stored securely and according to the data protection laws of your country. Device management is also useful as well for tracking the device if it becomes lost, or even wiping it if it's stolen. If you don't have the skills for actually doing this within your IT staff themselves, you can purchase this as a service from companies as well. So that is always an option if needed, and one that is worth considering. And finally, on this, you've got procedures. So Steve's mentioned a bit about breakages and damages. Think about how you're going to handle that. Where will the students go once the device is broken? Obviously, IT will have to check it over to make sure that it can't be repaired in-house. But then from there, what happens to it? How do you track it? How do you deal with repeat offenders for it? And what happens when the device is being sent to repair? Do the students get a spare device, or do they have to suffer for a couple of days and learn what happens when when they do break the device? So again, those are things that vary depending on the school and the requirements of the school. But again, just things to consider. And likewise, reporting problems. So your IT support will have a help desk, I'd imagine. So staff will be reporting problems to that. Should students be able to report problems to that as well if they have issues with their iPads? That again could lead to a dramatically increased workload for the staff, but it also means that things will get resolved quicker, and the students wouldn't necessarily have to leave lessons in order to request IT support. And finally, next slide, please, Mike. Avoiding surprises. Well, you're never going to fully be able to avoid all surprises, but planning helps enormously with this. You want to test things, test them again, and test them again. Before we actually started, before we start really any one-to-one process, we always pick a group of students and staff to do a trial with. So give the device out to them, see how they get on with things, and don't expect everything to work perfectly. In fact, it's better when it doesn't work perfectly. You want people to be trying things and pushing the boundaries, seeing what works and seeing what doesn't work, so then you can fix that before the issues you find are become a major problem when every student has a device and is using them in school. And make sure you give yourself enough time to do this trial. If you try and rush pushing iPads out or laptops or whatever out to students, that only is going to create problems. You want to make sure you give yourself enough time to test something, find out what doesn't work, and then, as Steve said, just run through that iterative process and fix things, try it again, and so on. You'll also get a fair few surprises with this as well. The students will be doing things you're not expecting, as will the staff as well. And again, that's something you can feed into the process, and I'll talk about that in a second. But you want to see what works well and what doesn't work well. Identify things where you can make changes, make those changes, then see what happens then. And also work with companies and establishments that have done this before. So as Steve's mentioned, there are a number of people that have done this now, and certainly it's become a lot more common than when we did this 10 years ago. So visit different sites and speak to different companies and different people. See what works for them and why they've made some decisions. Each iPad or each one-to-one implementation has to be unique to each school, because what works well from a learning point of view for one school isn't the same in another school, and that can be schools that are a couple hundred miles apart in completely different socioeconomic areas, or even just schools that are just next door to each other. So it's what works best for you and finding that and then trialing that out. Expectations is another thing as well. So getting expectations for the school is very important. What do you want the device to do? What classroom problems is it solving? Because again, learning has to be at the heart of all of this. And identifying as well expectations from staff. So how does staff think the device is going to behave when it is being used in the classroom? How does it think? How do they think that the student device is going to behave? Should students be able to present to the projector or TV screen in the room? Identifying those areas and making staff aware of them so that they can have time to familiarize themselves with how everything will behave once they have a class set of students in front of them. You've also as well got expectations from students and parents, because fundamentally they're going to be using the device. So how will the device behave when it's in school and also outside of school as well? Are there restrictions on what the students can and can't do? Does that only apply in school? And what is supported and what isn't? If a student is having problems with their home wireless, Is it up to the school to fix that, or is that up to the parents to try and sort it? Making those expectations clear and passing them on to each individual, each party, helps enormously with workload once you're actually implementing this. And finally, feedback. This is probably the most important one, really. You need to regularly collect feedback. So speaking with staff, but also speaking with students, because students will become your largest customer base. Use this to, again, identify areas that are working well and areas that aren't working quite so well. And again, that can be fed into the mix, from a deployment point of view, from a staff use point of view, from a student use point of view, as well from a process point of view as well. And so it all becomes a constant cycle of learning and seeing what works well, seeing what doesn't work well, and seeing what will work well for you and your school. So that's everything from me now. So I'll pass us on to, I'll pass you on to Jonathan from Pagabo.
Thanks, David. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Jonathan Oram. I'm the National Framework Manager over at Pagabo, and I look after and manage the ICT Solutions Framework here, of which Red Kite and Jigsaw have been a part of in various ways. Next slide, please, Mike. So very briefly, who are Pagabo? Because I think some of you may be aware of us, some of you may not. We as an organisation are framework managers who will procure a range of frameworks on behalf of various contracting authorities, which are then available to the wider public sector, including education establishments. All the frameworks that we procure are in line with the current public contract regulations, which is really important. When you're looking to find a way of procuring your iPads or your other devices and your network solutions and all of those elements that Adam, David and Steve have talked around, and you want to implement your one-to-one, it's all great that you go there and you're going to do that, but you then need to go and purchase this equipment in a compliant manner. You're obliged to do so when the volumes as such. So we have those frameworks in place to help you do that, of which we have a range of providers sat on there. So we have a range of other construction-based frameworks, which a lot of people know Pagabo for. But it's important to know that we have these goods and services-based frameworks as well, of which ICT Solutions is one of those. And that really has been designed for schools in particular. We designed it in conjunction with the Red Kite Learning Trust. And it was with Dave and Steve's input into this to make sure that we've got a solution through the framework which will enable you as an education establishment to be able to provide this one-to-one learning solution to your pupils and also to enable your staff to do so. So, with all that in mind, it has been taken into consideration, and we believe we've got a very well crafted framework in there to be able to give you a full wider solution on there as well. Next slide, please, Mike. So why use the framework as a whole, and why use Pagabo, I suppose, as much as anything else as well? The frameworks are all compliant, so you tick that box straight away from an audit point of view. The frameworks are flexible in what they are able to provide you in terms of various different solutions. There's value for money which is given. We've gone through a whole tender process with the wider market and have a limited list now of providers who are the top scoring quality and price, giving you the overall value for money. You can direct award or compete your requirements. Again, added flexibility around how you want to engage with the provider. Quite common that you may end up doing direct award through this with one of the providers like Jigsaw 24 on the framework, and they'll be able to take you through and hold your hand through this process, providing you with project management services as well to help you get through and cover all those bases that have been raised and those issues that have been raised on today's webinar. We want to point out, Steve mentioned around how can these devices be purchased, as a one-to-one learning solution through the likes, working with the likes of Jigsaw. You can go with the capital or a leasing agreement. We can sort that through the framework as well. That's also applicable to the other providers on the framework. There are options there. Next slide, please. So very briefly, areas covered by the framework. Obviously, iPads is what we're kind of talking around here predominantly, but also other tablets with there. So your your Chromebooks, your Microsoft Surfaces, your Microsoft laptops, other touch devices as well. So what we don't cover on Framework though is desktops or servers, because they are very varied, and there are some very other quality frameworks out that cover those aspects. We also have mobile device management software solutions. We've got the one-to-one payment management software and the overall solution that applies to that. We roll all those up into a single solution so that you can appoint a single provider to be able to purchase and implement a full one-to-one learning solution. You've got all the accessories that you need, the charging trolleys, the power adapters, the styluses, all these little bits that you need that will add the benefit of having and implementing a one-to-one learning solution that will make it success with both the teachers and the students, therefore, bringing that learning outcome to life as well. As Dave mentioned earlier, the network, you need to make sure that's all in place and it's there. We've got a solution there. We've got providers who can come in and do surveys that can do and check on those and make sure that and upgrade your systems wherever you need it. So you've got a suitably stable and scalable solution within there. Cloud-based VoIP solutions, not necessarily applicable to a one-to-one, but it's kind of there as an aside, something we need to look at. And then the classroom learning piece about one-to-one and technology with the likes of Lego and their programming devices as well. So, looking at all of those aspects on there, it's a very brief whistle-stop tour of what we are, but we're here as a solution to be able for you to be able to engage with the likes of Jigsaw and other providers on the framework. So these are on there. This is a small snapshot of clients that we engage with and have worked with across various frameworks, including the ICT solutions framework. So again, we'd happily discuss those with you as well. So if there's anything else at any point, please feel free to contact myself or any of my colleagues, and we'll be able to pick up questions and answers for you. Over to you, Mike. So hopefully I've brought us reasonably back on track here, only a couple of minutes behind.
Reasonably. Fantastic. Thank you, Jonathan. And thanks to David, Steve and Adam for your insightful commentary about your journey using one-to-one technology at Red Kite Learning Trust. We've had a few questions come in through the Q&A feature, which we've set aside a little bit of time to deal with now. So let's take a look at these. I'm going to see if I can direct these at who might answer first. Let me see. So this one's a nice straightforward one. I think this one goes straight to David. The question is, how big an internet connection do you have at your school? It's a great question, because you talked about you need enough internet and you need enough network to support those devices. What are the actual numbers at your school, David?
So it'll obviously depend a bit on how big the school is, particularly if you're looking at giving one device per student. But all of our primary schools have got a 100 meg connection, and that's synchronous, so 100 meg up and down, and that's dedicated to them, and that is enough for them. Now, the largest school we've got, which is one-to-one with devices, is Harrogate Grammar, and they've got just over 2,000 student devices, and again a couple hundred staff devices, and they've got a 1 gig connection, again up and down, but they don't hit that at all. Really, it's if we were doing this now, I think a 500 meg connection would be sufficient for them.
Thank you. I think the next one is principally maybe for Steve, kind of maybe a finance question, but I think all of these questions, any one of you might have some insight into these. So this question has come in. How do you respond if a parent says they're struggling to contribute the suggested amount? So that's a great sort of slightly maybe contentious question. It'd be really good to hear, Steve, what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, I mean, I remember speaking to literally dozens of parents in relation to that, and it became a kind of sensitive, quiet discussion with the parent, and remembering that our scheme is a donation scheme, so it's totally kind of discretionary. The parent, what they're not doing is entering any kind of contract with us about it. So there was just a sensitive conversation that says, well, I appreciate that you might struggle to afford the suggested donation of £10 as it was, but might you be able to meet us part way towards that, recognising that would be a fantastic help to the school. But we as a school will stand with you in that decision. And we use discretion if there were parents with multiple siblings, for example. And so we tried to take a quietly sensitive view of it, recognising that, you know, the majority of parents were able and happy to donate as well, which really gave us a sort of a bedrock of financial sustainability.
Thank you, Steve. Has anyone got anything further to add to that? Maybe, I don't know, Adam, if you've got anything further to add to that from your point of view.
No, not particularly.
Fair enough. I'll move to the next question then, which you definitely have an input on, which is, and this is really for all three of you, I think, which is, I know that the trust has a vision to put a device in the hands of all students, but that one-to-one approach, do you vary the approach from one school to another?
Vary in what sense? The nature of the device, or the nature of how it's?
Maybe time scale, the pace of change in a school.
Yeah, I mean, if I just start off, I suppose from one question would be is that we would, whilst the trust has control over and provides the infrastructure upon which all devices sit, we have said to schools that those end user devices are at the discretion of the schools. However, with something like iPads, I think the benefits in terms of a single solution, in terms of financial models, in terms of training, we would look to be a one-to-one school trust with iPads. In terms of time scale, very definitely schools are in different places. You know, we've just recently introduced a single integrated network across the trust. We've moved on to a cloud-based MIS, and schools are at different stages of that journey, and schools are in different places in terms of what they're ready to take on. So very definitely in terms of the conversations about appetite and ability, because as Dave has mentioned already, and Steve has, you've got to have your infrastructure in place. You know, and a big part of the work that we've done was making sure that they are one-to-one device capable Wi-Fi networks and bandwidth, and that is the last 18 months has been that process of moving schools onto the infrastructure and all the benefits that brings. Bit of a circuitous answer, I'm afraid, but
fantastic. It's obviously it's a complex process, and there's no one size fits all, obviously, in your situation. So I think we've got time. Quite a few questions have come in, but I think we've got one more question here, which I think again be for the panel as a whole, which is if you were to do this again, what would you do differently? Are there any reflections on what you've done so far and things that you would change?
So I think from me, the one thing that I'd do differently with this is just get students more engaged from the start. So when we first started doing this, we had we'd engaged with staff, got them involved, and then tested things out with the students, and trialed out with the student groups. That worked well, and then looked at but then really our focus has gone back to being the staff. But once we actually developed the iPads and got the iPads out there, we'd formulated a group. Well, we got a group of students together, which were called iChamps. So they were students who were really enthusiastic about using devices, but became a source of, well, basically a knowledge resource, both for the staff, but also the wider student body. And they could as well talk to us about how they were using devices within lessons. And we found that invaluable, and then that helped, enormously in terms of looking and seeing, rather than just seeing it from our point of view, my point of view outside the classroom, or from Adam's point of view in front of a class. I actually saw it from the point of view of the students who's listening and taking the information in. and then that helped again just formulate how we how we change the technology and how we what provision we put in place to ensure that things work better.
I think from my, sorry, Steve.
Okay, so Adam, I think I would, as a finance lead, I would push the educators a bit more, firstly on sharing across the schools in our trust, now that we're a trust, and just building on that collaborative effort that has been born really out of COVID. And the second thing, I think, to echo your earlier point, would be I'd push the educators more on, how can we truly radically transformational and use this this hurdle we overcome when we become an iPad institution. How do we really harness that and really transform the way that we educate and get outcomes for our pupils and students? I'd push a bit more, I think.
I think I'd just add to what both Dave and Steve had earlier. It's an iterative process. So in terms of doing things differently, 8-9 years ago, Ilkley Grammar School launched a one-to-one iPad scheme. The essence of that is similar, but the technology and the ability to control and change how the system works, you have to be flexible and respond to that and implement new ways, so you're continually changing what you're doing.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again to all of you. Thanks to David, Steve, Adam and Jonathan for your contributions to this webinar. It's been fascinating to listen to your insights, and we really appreciate your support. I hope that those of you that have tuned in for the webinar have found this useful. We'll be following up with a copy of the slides that you've seen, and we hope to see you again on another Jigsaw webinar soon. So thanks for your time, and enjoy your evening. Thank you.